Welcome to our Lunch and Learn, excuse me, social and emotional supports at school. My name is Leslie Hansen. I am a parent consultant at the Utah Parent Center, and we are really excited to present this workshop today. This is the last of the Lunch and Learn series on social and emotional supports. And today we're going to be learning about supports at school. We hope you find this information very helpful. And during our discussion today, we will be providing an overview of these topics. If you'd like to discuss these topics further and how they may relate to your situation, please give our office a call. And you can see our phone number here. Or if you have questions, you may also email me at leslie@utahparentcenter.org. But before we get started, I would ask that you enter your name into the chat box. My name is Leslie Hansen, and I am joined today by Stephanie Roach, who is also a parent consultant, and she will also be manning the chat during this presentation. At the Utah Parent Center, we are parents helping parents. So each of us is a parent of a child in special education, and we understand from the parent perspective what it is like working with our special education teams. At the Utah Parent Center, we do provide one-on-one consultations. And we also are able to provide parent workshops such as this throughout the state, and all of our services are free. The Utah Parent Center is a statewide nonprofit organization that essentially helps parents navigate the special education process. So if you have attended our last workshops, this will be a review for you. If not, we're going to, some of these parts will be a review. We're just going to have a few slides that will talk about behavior, but if you have not been with us before, these will be very helpful, the next few slides, to be able to put in context what we're talking about through the rest of the presentation. So we're going to take a moment to review what we've learned in the last few weeks. So behavior is communication, but it's not always purposeful. The behavior may result from an environment, a physical condition, or a disability, or it could be more purposeful, perhaps expressing an unmet need in an annoying or challenging way, or even a destructive way. Problem behaviors also serve as a function. Because behavior can originate from many different sources, it is our responsibility as parents or educators to try to understand why the behavior is happening. If parents are frustrated because repeated punishment does not change their child's behavior, that signals the need for a different strategy, and the same at school. If problem behavior does not change despite consequences, then we just assume that the punishment is not addressing the problem. It is just managing the symptoms. And this is where we need to take a closer look in this activity and what is actually causing the behavior. So behavior can be something to use to get attention, approval, or reward, or it can be used to escape something like attending school or attending peers that they may not feel comfortable with, or adults, or even doing work, homework, or other work at home. Or it can be to control something, where they sit in the car, what they watch on TV, and what they will or will not wear. And then lastly, communication is a need. So it could be that the child is telling us that they're hungry or tired or thirsty or uncomfortable or anxious, or maybe they just are overwhelmed with maybe something that has been going on at school or something that the teacher has asked them to do, some sort of assignment. So now let's get into the multi-tiered systems of support. All students learn differently, and sometimes that path will work for one student, may not work for another student. MTSS is the framework that will help identify what learning paths will benefit the student's learning style. So in Utah, you may have heard it called something different, like UMTSS, which is Utah's multi-tiered system of support, or RTI, which is response to intervention. Again, this is a framework in which schools try different methods to help struggling students progress. As you can see here in Tier 1, and that's 80%, the green part of the triangle, students, these are All students are screened on a periodic basis to establish an academic and behavioral baseline and to identify struggling learners who need additional support. As you can see, 80% of the learners will fall into this first tier right here. The next tier here are targeted interventions. Students not making adequate progress in the regular classroom in tier 1 are provided with increasingly intensive instruction matched to their needs on the basis of the levels of performance and the rates of progress. So as you can see, about 15% will fall into that section there. And then we have tier 3, which you can see up here. Tier 3 is the most intensive interventions and comprehensive evaluations. At this level, this is where students receive individualized intensive interventions that target the student's skill deficits. This could also include functional behavior or a behavior intervention plan, which we will be discussing in the next few slides. If a student is not responding to this intervention, then the student will be eligible or evaluated for eligibility for special education services. So again, this is that small portion at about 5%. So let's now talk about functional behavior assessments. Regardless of a child's disability, if he or she has problems learning because of persistent behavioral concerns, or if the behaviors of the child are significantly disruptive to other children, the IEP team must consider whether specific interventions are needed to help the child learn new behavioral skills. At times, this may require something called a functional behavior assessment. To help the team develop appropriate interventions, any needed interventions must be written into the child's individualized education program, or IEP, and must be consistently used across all environments where the behavior is a concern. Let's talk about the ABCs of behavior. Now, this is something that the functional behavior assessment will look at. So parents and school staff need to be detectives and discover the needs being communicated. Like we talked about before in the earlier slides, communication behavior is communication, and we just need to figure out what that communication is telling us. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes we might have to observe or write down times or environments where the behavior is happening and look for a pattern. We also need to remember that what is a need to the child may not be a need to us. And this is the method that's often used in the gathering process when conducting the functional behavior assessments, also called an FBA or a FUBA. It can be used by parents and caregivers as well to try and find the source of problem behaviors. So let's talk about the specific steps when noticing these behaviors. First, we're going to want to look at the antecedents. So what is happening before the behavior begins? And then we're going to be looking at the behavior. So what is the challenging behavior? Identifying that behavior. And then they're going to look at the consequence. What is the result of that behavior? The person conducting the FBA or FUBA gathers the information through observation and data provided by educators, related service providers, and you, the parent. The antecedent, the event, cause, or condition that influences the behavior is something that, again, will be looked at as an antecedent. So they're going to be getting very detailed information in each of these categories. So I just want to give one quick example of maybe how this would look. So again, the antecedent is the cause or the event that influences the behavior. So if we have two children, Mary and Anne, sitting next to each other and they're arguing, that could be considered the antecedent. The behavior could be considered of what happens next. Mary begins to get upset and she hits Anne. That's the behavior. And the consequence would be, again, what happens as a result of that behavior? Well, Anne is hurt and Mary might get sent to the principal's office. So there's that consequence. But why is an FBA important? An FBA is an approach to figuring out why a student acts a certain way. It uses different methods to understand what is behind behavior challenges. The basic idea is that a student's behavior serves a purpose, and it is communication. Whether they know it or not, kids act in certain ways for a reason. So I'd like to provide an example of this as well. Say, for instance, Aaron has strong math skills, but when the teacher hands out a math worksheet, Aaron gets angry. He crumples up the paper and throws it at his classmates. He is sent to the principal's office, but the behavior continues and the teacher does not know what to do. The school does a functional behavior assessment and learns that although Aaron is good at math, he has trouble showing work on his word problems. This is why he is acting out, to avoid the stressful situation of math. And now the school needs to decide how to help him. And I just want to point out to the IDEA, which is the federal law that is over the requirements for an IEP, specifically requires that the IEP team shall, in the case of a child whose behavior interferes with his or her learning or that of others, consider, when appropriate, strategies, including positive behavioral interventions, other strategies, and supports to address that behavior. So this is something that is very important in your students' education, that if their behavior is causing challenges and preventing them from accessing education or the education of others, then something needs to be looked at and in a proactive way. So let's talk about when an FBA is appropriate or required. So it is appropriate when a student's behavior impedes their ability to learn or disrupts the learning of others. And again, we just talked about this. But I want you to know, and I want to really highlight that parents are important members of the IEP team that develops this FBA. You will be asked to give input, including what you have observed at home. As a parent, you can request that the team conduct the FBA where there is ongoing behavior that doesn't respond to typical interventions. So you don't have to wait until behavior hits a critical mass. Again, talking with your team or your school officials and providing information and that request. When positive behavior interventions and supports are effective, your child should make progress on the IEP goals. If he or she is not making progress or there is a new behavioral challenge that are keeping your child from making progress, parents should think about requesting a new FBA. And I always tell parents when there are problems, talking with the school, being proactive, working with those professionals at school to be able to see what interventions are needed for your child so that they can continue to make educational progress. You may also request an FBA if your child's challenging behaviors interfere with, again, their ability to learn or other children and their ability to learn. But it's always best to put your request in writing and keep a copy of it for yourself. Let's go on to when it is required. It is required when there has been a change of placement because a student has been removed from school more than 10 days, so a suspension. And this also includes in-school suspension, half-day suspension. So you as a parent, if your child is being suspended for things, for behavior, go ahead and make a log of when your child was suspended, what day, what the reason was possibly, and then how long that suspension was to last. So again, it is required, and it's required when there's a change of placement. So the IEP team must conduct what's called a manifestation determination meeting whenever it proposes the change of educational placement for a student with disabilities by removing them from school for more than 10 days due to a violation of the school's code of conduct. So again, these 10 days will trigger an automatic manifestation determination hearing. So let's talk about what are the steps to an FBA. First, the school or the behavior specialist conducting the FBA will want to identify the behavior. So again, identifying the behavior and agreeing on what behaviors need to change is the important thing to step one. And step two, using data, using multiple sources for collecting that data. So determining when the behaviors do and do not occur. Again, collecting information on the child's performance from as many sources as possible, and developing an informed guess about why the behaviors are occurring. So again, what's that function of behavior? We talked about that in a few slides back about what that behavior could be communicating. And so that's really what that team is trying to figure out through these steps and through that data that they are collecting. Again, you as a parent being able to provide data to the team as well about what you're seeing at home, or what you feel you are observing at school, or what your child is telling you is happening at school is also important. And then we have step 3. So gathering and, again, analyzing that data. So after defining the behavior, the team will pull together all the information that they have. They may look at school records. Again, they may interview school staff who know and work with the child, and they may screen or test the student for other areas of data. But again, like I said before, parents are always important in this process. And the goal of this analyzing the data is to answer these specific questions, such as when and where the behavior is happening. Where is the behavior not happening? How often is the behavior occurring? Who is around when the behavior occurs? And what tends to happen right before and right after that behavior? And again, your student can provide this information as well. And then they're going to make the hypothesis of possibly why the student is doing what they're doing and when it's happening. And again, that assessment and that hypothesis is a kind of a step in making sure that that behavior intervention plan is meeting the needs of the student. So let's just stop back at manifestation determination. Again, this was when a student was going to be suspended for 10 days. That is the trigger to a manifestation determination. But I want to quickly go over what that includes. So the team is going to ask, is the conduct related to a student's disability? Or is it the result of the LEA's failure to implement the IEP? So those are going to be specific questions that the team needs to answer in this process. If the team determines that the answer is yes to either one of these questions, then the team needs to address 2 things. Again, a functional behavior assessment. Does the child have one? Does the child need one? Or a behavior intervention plan. So again, does the child have a behavior intervention plan? If so, does the behavior intervention plan need to be reviewed and revised? Or if the child does not have one, does the child need a written behavior intervention plan? And that's more of the result that will come from a manifestation determination hearing in the process of trying to figure out what happened and why that happened. So next we have a BIP, developing a behavior intervention plan. So a BIP is a tool to support students' behavior needs. It is what we do for a student, not what we do to a student. And a BIP is not required, but schools are required to address student behavioral needs on an IEP. So again, this is something that may develop from that functional behavior assessment that the team now is able to, they have gathered enough data and they understand when and where the behavior is happening, that they can now use that information to write a BIP or a behavior intervention plan. But there are a couple of things that we need to think about when we look at behavior intervention plans. They should be in writing. It's very helpful that they're in writing. And some things to think about also, is it team developed? Is it based on the functional assessment, the functional behavior assessment? Have the manipulation of the antecedents, so that again is looking at the events and the actions and the circumstances around the behavior occur. So have they manipulated those antecedents? Have they looked at this in a variety of different settings and across many actions or circumstances? Does it include the strategies to strengthen appropriate behaviors? Does it include a crisis intervention plan? And that's only if it's needed. It doesn't necessarily have to require one of those. It depends on the student's needs and the behavior that they're trying to support. Does it have general educator input? And does it include modifications in the curriculum and or classroom expectations? So again, those are all good questions that the team should be looking at when they're writing a behavior intervention plan. Let's go on to what makes an effective behavior intervention plan, or a BIP. So a BIP will focus on providing positive behavior supports to teach or reinforce appropriate behavior skills. A behavior intervention plan is not the same thing as a school discipline plan that speaks to what happens if a student violates a rules or a code of conduct. It is a tool for developing more in-depth support and skill development for a student in order to achieve positive changes in the student's behavior. And it should be reviewed frequently. I always tell the parents that I'm working with, when a behavior intervention plan is first written, it's, if it's being effective, that's wonderful. But it may be helpful to go back in about 6 to 8 weeks to look at the behavior plan again, review and revise if needed. Sometimes the motivators or the rewards they use in a behavior intervention plan may change with the student maturing or being interested in something else. And so that's where it would be helpful for the parent to go back to the team, or even the team itself may notice these things as well, like these motivators are not working anymore, or these rewards that we're giving the student, they're just not interested. So then that's a really good time to go back and review how effective it is. So behavior can also be addressed in the IEP. And if we look at behavior in the IEP, we can have these certain things in mind. So do the goals address academic support, mental health needs, or behavioral needs? And does the child need a functional behavior assessment or related services, or a behavior intervention plan, or a crisis plan? So again, behavior can be addressed in the IEP if it's impeding the learning of themselves or others, and along with other strategies and goals for behavior, those can be addressed on the behavior intervention plan. But again, you as a parent, it's also important for you to be involved when addressing behavior in the IEP as well. So we're going to talk next about what those supports may look like in the school system. So if you see here, we have routines, silent signals, proximity, quiet corrections, giving students a task, environmental change, positive phrasing, and state the behavior you'd like to see. So we're going to go through those separately, and I'll give you some examples of those. As you may have noticed in your own home, routines may be very helpful for your child. So giving students multiple opportunities to practice classroom routines, provide ongoing support for routines and behaviors, and to reinforce expected behaviors and explain the consequences if the expectations are not met. So again, routines can help reduce or eliminate that inappropriate behavior and to teach appropriate behaviors in place of. And then silent signals. So creating a silent signal to remind your students to pay attention and remain on task. That could even be, eye-to-eye contact. That student knows that, they need to be back on task. I give my son a look, and he knows just by that look that he needs to figure out a different way to communicate with me. Proximity. Another great silent intervention could be by simply getting physically closer to the student, and you can get them on task without having to give verbal instructions. Quiet corrections. So when a student is off task, they are often seeking attention. So it is important for teachers to remove the stage when addressing them. So avoid using shame and intimidation to correct a student. Instead, quietly and quickly bend down and whisper to the student what you would like them to do and the consequence they will receive if the expectation is not met, and then move away. Giving students a task. If you notice a student has a behavioral challenge at a certain time of day, or in a certain class, giving them a task or an errand to complete for you may help kind of break up that routine that they normally may get in when they are trying to communicate a certain behavior, or it's a trigger for them. So that might kind of break up that time. And breaks are always good too, that they can walk around or get up out of the classroom and do something different for a few minutes. Positive phrasing. So this refers to focusing on the positive results of behavior rather than the negative. Teachers, they can easily get in the habit of threatening students with statements that say, if you don't, then I will. And I think parents can too. But state the behavior you would like to see. So positively narrate the behavior you want to see, or acknowledge students who meet the expectations in the right way. And even consider having that student take a break. Again, even if you ask them to go to the office and get a paper for you, or just taking just a break without doing anything. Students can benefit from a 3 to 5 minute break to get refocused. Consider allowing students to rest and reset during an activity or before a transitional break to a new task or a new class. And sometimes that will also help. Let's go on to least restrictive behavior interventions. So this is LRBI. LRBI is happens when making decisions about interventions. So this is guidelines. This is a policy. The IEP team must refer to the USBE, so Utah State Board of Education's least restrictive behavior intervention technical assistance manual. This manual provides information on research-based behavior interventions and procedures applicable to all Utah students, including students who have an IEP. So again, this is something that the teachers will resort to automatically, these positive behavior interventions listed in this LRBI manual. Even if the student has an IEP or without an IEP, this is something across all students. And right now, I don't believe that the manual is online. They were doing some changes to it, some updates, but you're welcome to check the USBE website. And we also will have it posted on our website as well once the updates have been made.
I just posted a link to it, Leslie. They must have put the other one back up because you're right, it wasn't there, but it is. So.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. And please go to that and kind of look at, it really does explain all of these things in great detail and when they should be used. And again, this is something that the teachers will refer to when they are figuring out behavior supports for students who have behavioral challenges, or just all students in general. So let's go on again to understanding what LRBI is. And we talked a little bit about this in the slide before, but it is based on the belief that appropriate behaviors can be taught. So replacing those negative behaviors or challenging behaviors with more positive behaviors, giving the student a chance to figure out coping mechanisms. If they're starting to get upset, what can I do instead of this or this? And so it's really important and has been very effective in schools to teach better behaviors. And lastly, keep it positive. So like many parents, you have probably found that related punishment does not teach your child more socially appropriate behaviors. That is because punishment is just a response to an inappropriate behavior, but it does not teach a replacement behavior. And that is the key, again, teaching that replacement behavior. And as you have learned from the last few weeks, you as a parent have the opportunity to teach those positive behaviors or those replacement behaviors at home as well, with what you and how you interact with your child and what you ask them to do, and what expectations you want them to meet. Okay, so again, contact us if you have more questions about your specific situation. We would love to help you. We do have a poll that we will launch, and hopefully I can launch that poll. So this poll just helps us know what is how well we did, what we may need to change, how much of the information you thought was helpful. And it's just a good way to let us know. So if you take a few minutes and actually, maybe Stephanie, can you see if you can launch that poll?
Hopefully it's launched now. Hopefully you can all see it.
Thank you, Stephanie. So at this time, we can take questions that you may have and make some clarifications if something wasn't necessarily clear to you. So are there any in the chat, Stephanie?
There were a couple, but I think we got them answered. Although if anybody needs follow-up or a better answer than was typed in, don't hesitate to let us know.
Perfect. I'm going to stop my share. Okay. And you can also unmute yourselves if you'd like. We have a small enough group, I believe, that we could just have a good discussion if that's something that you'd like.
One of the questions while we're waiting for people to unmute was finding it. Well, the comment was finding the antecedent can be very challenging. Is there any advice on how to properly identify antecedents? And I just responded by saying that, yeah, it can just be trial and error. We may not identify the correct antecedent the first time. It's hard to always know. And you just kind of have to look and see how the student responds to the interventions that are developed from the functional behavior assessment and see if they start responding. And if they do, great. Hopefully we've identified the correct behavior, the correct antecedent, and the correct supports. And if not, kind of have to start the process over. And that can be looking, starting again to look for that antecedent and trying to figure things out. Do you have anything to add to that, Leslie?
With my own son, I've had to do this several times, and I just look for patterns. For instance, my son likes to sleep on the couch instead of his bed. Not sure why. Have not figured that out yet, but as he was always getting triggered around bedtime, and through, again, trial and error, but trying to figure out a pattern, we're able to determine that he was scared that he'd have to go back to his bed and sleep instead of sleeping on the couch. And so we're working through that with different supports, but again, just looking for patterns. I think, again, obviously it's going to be a little bit harder, but I think over time, if you're able to, and I've even taken a log before of certain things that may be triggers for him and trying to weed those out.
So another one of the questions that was in the chat is just about the 10 days of suspension prior to manifestation determination. So maybe we could talk about that for just another quick second, including partial days and in-school suspension if they're not providing services and support. If they are providing services and support during in-school suspension, then it wouldn't be counted toward that 10 days. But if they're not, if they're just sitting in the office and just sitting there without work, that would count as a day.
Thank you for that clarification, Stephanie.
Yeah, but any other questions about that? Because that can be confusing. I mean, if the school calls you and says your child's out of control, you need to pick them up, and the school day ends at 2:30 and you have to go pick them up at 2 o'clock, that counts as a day of suspension. So keep track of that. And they do not have to be consecutive. They can be all over the place. And 10 days is when it's required to hold a manifestation determination. But if there's a pattern of suspension surrounding a particular behavior or a situation, you can definitely talk about that anyway, especially if there's not already a functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plan in place. Work on trying to figure out if those supports can try to prevent the student from getting to 10 days of suspension, because that would be better than waiting until they have been suspended all those days and then putting the supports in place, of course.
I do want to bring up one thing, and if you had attended the first lunch and learn on the social and emotional supports, there was something that Michelle talked about in, some sensory type behaviors that we may think are sensory and possibly maybe they are not. But kind of going along with that, I would say just as a tip for parents that are looking at behavior in school, that it also could be some sort of sensory processing issue. So say for instance, and a lot of parents think behavior, it's bad, there's always it's always negative, behavior is always negative, and that's not the case. Behavior could be that your child is falling asleep in the back of the class. That is a behavior, right? But we need to figure out why that's happening. And it could be that your child is not being stimulated enough during that period of time during the day. And so they are falling asleep. So if you're suspecting anything like that, that maybe your child does have some sensory processing challenges, or maybe you don't know that they do, but you just think that, gosh, it's happening around a certain time of day, or something that leads you to believe that maybe it is sensory oriented. Asking the team to maybe bring in an occupational therapist to talk about the behavior, and see if maybe your child needs a sensory diet. If your child already has some sensory processing difficulties and they are well known, having a sensory diet that maybe can help support the child in better behavior, or more focus or something like that. So that's also an option. Does anyone have any tips on how you have utilized our tips, our lunch and learn information during the last few weeks? Sometimes it's hard to process it and use it right away. So it does take a couple weeks, I think, to really nail down what you want to be looking for and to just see how you can use the information. But does anyone have any examples of how they've used it in the past few weeks? Okay.
Got a quiet group today. It's a Monday.
We do. It is a Monday. You're right. All right. Okay. Well, Stephanie, do you have anything else? Anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I think that I say no and then I start talking again. I think behavior issues are pretty challenging across the board. I know that issues have been escalating and situations have become more difficult as the years have gone by. And I think it's something that's on a lot of people's minds at every level, trying to figure out how to support the students. And what I love the most about the concept of LRBI, least restrictive behavior intervention, and positive behavior supports is exactly what Leslie's been talking about, that behavior is communication. They're trying to tell us something. What are they trying to tell us? Because again, as Leslie said, the consequence of the behavior usually doesn't change the behavior, the punishment, or the immediate response to the behavior is, I'm not saying that consequences aren't necessary. They can be very appropriate and necessary and important, but they're not going to change the behavior. It's teaching the students what the appropriate replacement behavior is that's going to really eliminate the unwanted behavior. And I think that's kind of a paradigm shift from what we've understood and practiced in the past. But I think it's very important to know so that we can try to help support our students in effective ways to change behavior now. But Leslie, there is a comment in the chat. Did you see?
I did. Michelle said I did use the questioning with my daughter to change my perspective, and that was really helpful. Well, great, Michelle. I'm glad that these ideas and tips are able to be implemented.
Well, and then another, one of the other questions was, how do we know if we've identified the correct antecedent? And sometimes the students can tell us, and they may not know, like they may not truly understand it themselves. I don't always understand why I do what I do, but having that conversation with them, I think that's great. Just talking to them and asking them. And maybe they can provide some insight that you may not have thought about before or may not be easily identified, because we don't always catch what's happening to cause a behavior. So if the student is able to articulate that, can be really helpful to talk to them.
And I like what Stephanie said. It really is the need that your child has may not be in something that you've even entertained. And our needs are not the same. And so trying not to diminish your child's need because you just, why do they need their bear with them every moment of the day? You know what I mean? So just being able to, again, understand. And like Michelle did, she questioned her daughter and not change her perspective. So that's great. And I will say too, just to add or reiterate that a successful behavior intervention plan at school is also something that can be implemented at home. And so asking your team, how can I help my child at home? What would this intervention look like at home? And really being able to be consistent will help your child learn that the more appropriate behavior, and then be able to implement it in both settings. I think that's what's really important, right? We want the child to implement that better behavior across all settings. So again, home is one of those settings where it'd be very helpful to have good behavior. So talking with your team.
And then I think another thing that Leslie brought up that is important is revisiting it. Just taking a look, giving it a few weeks to make sure everybody understands their role, to let the student learn what the process is going to look like, let the teachers have time to learn and implement the process, and then meet again and say, what do we think? Do we think we've identified the appropriate behavior? Do we think we've identified good supports for the student? Are they responding? Do we need to adjust anything? Behavior intervention plans are pretty fluid. Rarely do we get it all 100% right on the first try because people are complex. And then Leslie also mentioned that sometimes the student's motivation may change, or their response to the the positive reinforcer may change, and then we may need to do a different positive reinforcer even if we found the right one the first time. So reviewing these things, taking a good look, and seeing, are we moving in the right direction, or do we need to tweak some things, is also a really critical component of behavior intervention plans. And more frequently than an IEP, I always suggest to the parents that are, in the process of developing a behavior intervention plan, hey, give it several weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. And depending on the situation, maybe shorter, maybe longer, but meet and just ask, how are things going? And see, it can be pretty important to just review and make sure things are going.
Well, wonderful. If we don't have any other comments, we don't have any in the chat. If someone would like to unmute, we're able to have a good discussion. But if not,
I do have
perfect.
a question. So I don't have like an IEP, but my son, so he's in first grade, and I was trying to think back to how many messages, because we use like a text messaging app with the teachers. Well, they'll send like the newsletters or reminders, but then also one-on-one parent notifications. And he's also called. So that's why I was trying to figure out how many incidents, but I think there's been maybe like, probably like 6 this year where, you know, he calls me to kind of ask for help to work with my son about like interrupting during like floor time and just being very handsy with his classmates. So I was trying to think through, right? How could I, because I've always said, sure, let me talk with him. I've talked with him and he does fine for a few weeks and then it happens again. So I was trying to think like what maybe the solution is something in that moment, right? That how could he have a fidget toy or something where he would keep his hands to himself? But then would that be distracting to the others? So it was just like, I was going down a spiral, like not even sure, right? Like how to have that discussion.
Sure. I do think, you know, you've kind of opened that discussion up with the teacher, and I think that's really helpful. Just by virtue of the classroom, the teacher should be implementing the positive behavior intervention supports, or the LRBI, the least restrictive behavioral supports inside the classroom. It could be that other students are doing that as well, but for your particular student, maybe a fidget toy is something that the teacher would say, you know what, maybe we try this. There is an important distinction though between a toy and a support.
Mhm.
And so that's probably something that will need to be taught to the student if a fidget toy is allowed. And that's something that is taught to a lot of our students who have assistive technology, you know, computers or other devices to help them access their education. And it could be looked at as a toy, but really teaching them that it is different than a toy. This is something that can support you. So that is something that I would definitely bring up with your school, or if your child has an IEP, with the team, and just addressing those. And some of that is developmental as well, right? And so they may, as a team, realize that this is a developmental issue, as far as, you know, first graders are probably going to be doing things like that, but how can we maybe reward him when he doesn't, or support him so that it doesn't lead to something else? Does that make sense, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think the key maybe was what you guys said about revisiting more often.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think, right, like trying anything now is sort of just like throwing ideas at the wall.
Well, you know, and what the teacher may do, and what you can do as a parent, is to say, you know, I had this just make a log, right? I had this conversation with this teacher. We're going to implement this and see how it works. And then just going back, and if he ends up needing some sort of functional behavior assessment, you have that log where you can say, you know, we've tried these interventions in this setting and they weren't successful, or maybe they were successful. And that's something that the teacher that, you know, you're trying the interventions with can speak to as well. If you found that it was different, maybe it wasn't as often, those types of things. But yeah, revisiting that behavior, making sure that what you're doing is working, or it's not. Let's hurry and figure out something different.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see, Michelle says, I do find the slow progress of change with so many changes to make to be overwhelming. What suggestions do you have to be more aware of seeing change happen? What do you think, Stephanie?
It is overwhelming, especially when there are a lot to make. And I think, you know, as we look at the IEP process, we don't usually, every student is different, but don't usually make like 50 goals, right? Because that can be very, very overwhelming, even though there may be 50 things to change. So you pick what's most important, work on those, and then, you know, move down the line and work on more things as you go. And so for me, what's helpful when I've got a huge thing with many moving parts and lots of components is prioritizing, and then chipping away at the most important, and then moving on to the ones that are less important. And sometimes they solve themselves. And so I think with behavior, especially, knowing that there's a lot to do, but if you can see progress on some things that are very concerning, and, make some progress, get some good supports, and then you can move down the line. I think that can be really helpful. So, with the team, talking about it with the team and what everybody feels is the most important thing to work on. I think that can be really helpful, just prioritizing and then realizing that Rome wasn't built in a day, right? It's going to take some time to get through the list, even though it is frustrating. But if you can see that progress happening, it can be motivating to both the student and to, I think as a parent, it would be motivating to me to see those behaviors shifting, and hopefully to the team. I don't know, that's my first thought. What do you think, Leslie?
I really like what you said about the motivation. I feel like when students feel better about themselves, they will behave better. When they have more of a positive view of themselves and not say, I'm just a troublemaker, or nobody likes me, or, I'm just, causing all of these things to happen that aren't good. So again, just that motivation for that student to continue to feel good about themselves and know that, I'm changing, and I don't like it when I do this either, but now look, I'm not doing that as much, or I'm not doing that at all. And so.
And I think that's why positive interventions are so critical, because shame and guilt are terrible motivators. If you're ashamed or feel guilty or feel bad about what you do and who you are and, the things that you do, it doesn't provide motivation to change. It in general, it causes people to feel less motivated to change and like they can't do it. So, I find myself, I was thinking about it this weekend. I said to my daughter, "You're 21, you shouldn't be doing that." Well, that's terrible. I'm not giving her anything even remotely helpful to try to fix it. I'm just shaming her because she did something that maybe I thought she shouldn't have done when she was 21. And so, if we can take that shame and that guilt out of trying to replace behaviors, it's much more motivating, much more empowering to help students and kids feel like they can do it, if they're not being shamed for the behaviors that they're doing. So I think that's a great point, Leslie.
Perfect. Anything else? Okay, well, again, if you have questions or thank you, Michelle. If you have questions or things that you'd like to talk about, your own personal situations, please give us a call. We would love to help you. We are in the office Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So, all right, everyone, thank you again. This is the last of the Lunch and Learn for this series, and we have much more coming. So please check our